heavy iron gates of Oakwood Memorial Gardens didn't just separate the dead from the living. They separated the elite from the uninvited. Officer Thomas Higgins sat in his cruiser, the engine humming a low, predatory growl. To him, the world was divided into two categories: those who belonged in this zip code and those who were a problem. Under a weeping gray sky, a small group gathered around a mahogany casket. In the center stood a woman draped in charcoal wool, her face veiled in black lace. To Higgins, she was just a silhouette. Another person of color in a neighborhood where he usually only saw them holding lawnmowers or delivery bags. He didn't see a grieving mother. He saw a statistical anomaly. He saw a nobody. He stepped out of the car, the leather of his duty belt creaking with the weight of his perceived authority. He didn't wait for the pastor to finish the final prayer. He didn't care about the sanctity of the grave. He wanted to exert the only thing that made him feel powerful: the badge. "I need to see some ID," Higgins barked, his voice cutting through the soft rain like a serrated blade. The woman didn't flinch. She slowly lifted her veil, revealing eyes that had stared down senators and scrutinized the highest laws of the land. But Higgins was blind to the fire in those eyes. He saw a woman who wasn't bowing fast enough. "Officer," she said, her voice a calm, terrifying silk. "We are burying my son. You are standing on sacred ground." "I'm standing on a crime scene if you don't show me some plastic," Higgins sneered. He felt the rush of the asterisk power gap. In his mind, he was the titan, and she was the dust. He enjoyed the silence of the mourners. He mistook their shock for submission. When she refused to move, he saw it as his invitation to escalate. He lunged, spinning her around, the metal handcuffs ratcheting shut with a series of cold, mechanical clicks. He shoved her into the back of the cruiser, laughing when her forehead hit the plexiglass. "You should have just complied, lady. Now you're just another number in the system." But the system was her home. The shift happened the moment they crossed the threshold of the precinct. Higgins marched her in like a trophy, tossing her leather clutch onto the intake desk. "Got a live one," he announced to the room. "Trespassing and resisting. Thinks she's a lawyer." Sergeant Miller, a man who had seen enough of Higgins's trophies to know trouble when it walked in, reached for the clutch. He pulled out a black leather bifold. He expected a driver's license with a local address. Instead, he found a gold-embossed seal that seemed to radiate its own light under the flickering fluorescence. The asterisk Supreme Court of the United States. The color drained from Miller's face. The room, usually a cacophony of ringing phones and clacking keyboards, went deathly silent. It was the silence of a vacuum before an explosion. "Higgins," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "What have you done?" Higgins, still smirking, leaned over. "What? Is she a flight risk?" "She's a justice," Miller choked out. At that moment, the power gap flipped. The nobody in the back of the room stood tall, her bruised wrists still locked in steel, but her presence suddenly filled the entire building. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was the embodiment of the very Constitution Higgins had sworn to protect. The arrogant officer realized his mistake too late. The woman he had treated like dirt was the one who could move mountains. He had arrested the law itself, and by sunset, the $18 million price tag of his prejudice would be the least of his worries. The hunter had become the prey, and the silence in the precinct was the sound of his career and his life. Crumbling to ash, the rain wasn't just falling, it was mourning. It fell in heavy, rhythmic pulses against the silk of Evelyn Carter's umbrella, a cold reminder that the world had stopped for her, even as the rest of Montgomery County moved on. Beneath the umbrella, she was a statue of grief. Her son, Cameron, was 24. A life that was supposed to be a marathon cut into a tragic sprint by a patch of black ice and a concrete pillar. This was the asterisk emotional anchor, asterisk. The scene was designed to be sacred. The smell of wet earth, the sight of a mahogany casket hovering over a dark void, and the muffled sobs of a family broken in half. Every viewer watching would feel the weight in their chest. They weren't just watching a video. They were standing at that grave. They were feeling the raw, jagged edge of a mother's heartbreak. And then came the boots, the sound of heavy, polished leather crushing the funeral wreaths was the first note of the officer's villainy. Officer Thomas Higgins didn't just enter the scene, he desecrated it. When he spoke, he didn't lower his voice for the dead. He spoke with the sharp, metallic tang of a man who enjoyed being the loudest thing in a quiet room. Move back from the hole, he commanded. The word hole was a physical blow. It wasn't a grave to him. It wasn't a final resting place for a beloved son. It was a hole in a neighborhood where he didn't want these people to be. The emotional investment of the audience surged into a white-hot protective instinct. You don't interrupt a funeral. You don't insult a grieving mother. Higgins stood there, thumbs tucked into his duty belt, a smirk playing on his lips that signaled he felt superior to every tear shed that morning. He looked at the luxury cars parked nearby and saw theft, not success. He looked at the black mourners and saw a threat, not a family. By the time he reached for his handcuffs, the audience wasn't just annoyed. They were rooting for his total destruction. "I'm not asking you again, lady. ID or the back of the car," Higgins sneered, stepping onto the artificial grass lining the grave. Evelyn finally looked at him. Her eyes weren't just wet with tears. They were sharp with the wisdom of decades in the courtroom. She spoke with a quiet, devastating dignity that made Higgins look like a petulant child with a lethal toy. "My son is being lowered into the earth, officer. Have you no soul?" Higgins didn't answer with words. He answered with force. The moment he grabbed her arm, the moment the screen would show the rough, calloused hand of the law bruising the delicate black wool of a mourning coat, the trap was set. The villainy was now at its peak. He wasn't just a bad cop. He was a monster who had stolen a mother's final goodbye. As he marched her away, the camera would linger on the abandoned casket, sitting alone in the freezing rain. That image is the anchor. It's the visual that stays in the viewer's mind, fueling their hunger for the payback that is coming. They are now locked in. They won't click away because they need to see this man lose everything. They need to see the nobody he insulted turn into the judge who will dismantle his life. The emotional debt has been recorded, and the audience is waiting for the $18 million collection. The transition from the cemetery to the precinct is where the story shifts from a tragedy of oppression to a thriller of retribution. In the back of the cruiser, the air was thick with the smell of cheap upholstery and the copper tang of Evelyn's own blood where the cuffs bit into her skin. Officer Higgins hummed a tuneless melody, his eyes dancing with the reflected red and blue of his light bar. He felt like a conqueror. He had no idea he was driving his own career into a graveyard. This was the asterisk tension peak. For the viewer, the frustration is at a boiling point. We have seen a woman at her most vulnerable, burying her child, assaulted and humiliated. The reveal is the release valve for that pressure. When they entered the precinct, the atmosphere was routine. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and officers traded jokes. Higgins marched Evelyn in with a swagger that screamed mission accomplished. He threw her leather clutch onto the booking counter with a dismissive thud, the sound of a man throwing away trash. Failure to identify and resisting, Higgins announced to Sergeant Miller. Found her causing a scene at Oakwood. Thought she was above the law. Sergeant Miller, a man with 30 years of seeing the worst of humanity, didn't look up immediately. He reached for the clutch, his gloved fingers unzipping the side pocket to find a driver's license. He wanted to get this over with. He pulled out a slim, black leather bifold. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in ripples. Miller flipped the wallet open. He expected a Maryland license or a library card. Instead, his eyes hit a heavy, solid gold medallion. It caught the harsh overhead fluorescent light, gleaming with an authority that seemed to physically push Miller back. Above the eagle and the scales of justice, the words * Supreme Court of the United States were embossed in crisp, undeniable gold. Miller's breath hitched. He looked at the photo on the ID, the same sharp, intelligent face currently looking at him through a mess of rain-matted hair. And then at the title, * the Honorable Justice Evelyn Carter. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. Miller's hands began to shake. He looked at Higgins, who was still smirking, leaning against the counter as if he were waiting for a coffee. "Higgins," Miller whispered, the word barely escaping his throat. "Do you know who this is?" "Yeah, a trespasser," Higgins retorted, his voice sounding unnervingly loud in the dead air. Miller didn't answer. He turned the wallet around so Higgins could see it. The smirk on the officer's face didn't just fade. It disintegrated. The blood left his cheeks so fast he looked like a ghost. For a heartbeat, Higgins's brain tried to find a way out, a joke, a mistake, a fake ID, but the weight of that gold medallion was too heavy to ignore. At that exact moment, the precinct's high-priority radio erupted. "All units, we have a code red. Calls coming in from the governor and the U.S. Attorney General. A Supreme Court justice has been abducted." The reveal was complete. The nobody was gone. In her place stood a titan of the American legal system, her bruised wrists still locked in steel, but her power now absolute. The payoff for the audience is the look on Higgins's face. The moment he realizes that every word he said, every shove he gave, and every bruise he caused was a nail in his own coffin. The justice-served moment has arrived, and the destruction of Officer Higgins has officially begun. The gray mist of Montgomery County served as more than just weather. It was a visual representation of the systemic conflict that had simmered beneath the surface of this affluent suburb for decades. On one side of the iron gates stood Oakwood Memorial Gardens, a sanctuary of wealth, history, and predominantly white lineage. On the other side was the reality of a changing America. And Officer Thomas Higgins was the self-appointed gatekeeper of the old world. Higgins didn't see a woman in mourning. He saw a demographic. In his mind, the luxury SUVs parked along the cemetery road weren't signs of success. They were out of place. This is the core of racial profiling, the criminalization of presence. To Higgins, the mere act of a group of black citizens occupying an elite space was a reasonable suspicion in itself. He didn't need a crime. He just needed a contrast. As he approached the gravesite, the cinematic tension was built on the collision of two different Americas. One was the America of Evelyn Carter, a world of meritocracy, where a woman could rise from a relentless prosecutor to the highest bench in the land through sheer brilliance and the protection of the law. The other was the America Higgins inhabited, a world of us versus them, where the badge was a tool for social sorting rather than public safety. IDs. "Now," Higgins commanded, his voice cold. When Dr. Richard Carter, a man who saved lives daily as a chief of surgery, tried to speak, Higgins didn't see a doctor. He saw a challenge to his hierarchy. The systemic conflict reached its peak when Higgins stepped onto the artificial turf of the grave, his boot crushing a floral wreath. It was a physical manifestation of the disrespect the system, often shows to minority grief. In that moment, the grave wasn't just a place of rest. It was a battleground where the dignity of a black family was being weighed against the ego of a prejudiced officer. Evelyn Carter's response was a masterclass in legal defiance. She didn't argue with emotion. She argued with the Fourth Amendment. She spoke the language of the Constitution, the very document that was supposed to protect her, yet was being ignored by the man standing in front of her. You saw a group of black people in a neighborhood where you believe we do not belong, she said, her voice steady. This line is the heartbeat of the systemic conflict. It identifies the why behind the interaction. Higgins didn't arrest her because she was a criminal. He arrested her because she didn't fit his mental map of Oakwood. When the handcuffs snapped shut, it wasn't just an arrest. It was an assault on the promise of equal protection. The narrative frames this real-world issue in a way that resonates with a USA audience by showing the extreme checkmate. It takes the everyday reality of profiling and places it in a scenario where the victim is the ultimate authority on the law. The $18 million settlement and the stripping of qualified immunity aren't just plot points. They are the audience's wish fulfillment for a system that often fails to hold itself accountable. By the time the script concludes, the cinematic drama has served a higher purpose. It has shown that while systemic rot is deep, the law in its purest form, represented by Evelyn Carter, has the power to burn that rot away. Higgins didn't just lose a case. He was dismantled by the very system he tried to weaponize against an innocent mother. The true viral power of this story lies in the transition from a courtroom victory to the absolute, granular dismantling of a bully's life. For an audience, a simple apology is a whisper. Total ruin is a roar. To make this narrative satisfy the deep human craving for karma, the resolution follows Officer Thomas Higgins until there is nothing left of the man who smirked at a grave. The $18 million settlement was the first domino. In many cases, the city or the insurance company pays the bill and the officer keeps his pension. Not this time, because the federal judge stripped Higgins of his qualified immunity asterisk. He was cast out of the protective bubble that usually shields police from personal financial liability. The nobody he had assaulted was now the lien holder of his life. The process of his destruction was cinematic and clinical. A week after the settlement was announced, the moving trucks arrived at Higgins's suburban home, the house he had bought with a decade of taxpayer-funded salary. The audience sees the irony. The man who tried to protect a wealthy neighborhood was now being evicted from his own. His savings accounts, meticulously built for a comfortable retirement, were drained to satisfy the judgment. Every cent was diverted into the Cameron Carter Center for Justice. The bully wasn't just broke. He was funding the very people he spent 12 years harassing. But the professional ruin was even more absolute. The blue wall of silence didn't just crack, it collapsed on top of him. The police union, sensing the toxic fallout of the viral body cam footage, publicly disowned him. He wasn't just fired. He was decertified, his name added to a national registry of disgraced officers. He could never wear a badge again. He couldn't even work as a low-level security guard. To the world of law enforcement, Thomas Higgins was a ghost. Then came the criminal trial. The total ruin resolution requires the antagonist to face the very bars he once put others behind. Seeing Higgins sit at a defense table, no longer in a crisp blue uniform, but in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, provides the ultimate visual payoff. He sobbed when the jury read the verdict. Guilty on federal civil rights charges. He was sentenced to 72 months. The man who loved the sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut now had to live with that sound every morning at 6 a.m. in a federal cell. The story concludes 5 years later, providing the "where are they now" moment that viewers love. We see a grainy shot of a bus terminal at 3 a.m. A man is pushing a mop across a dirty linoleum floor. His shoulders are hunched, his face lined with the bitterness of a man who lost a kingdom he never deserved. This is Higgins. He is a convicted felon working the graveyard shift for minimum wage. He pauses his mop when he sees a news segment on the terminal's flickering TV. It's Justice Evelyn Carter. She is sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court, her voice calm and authoritative as she delivers a landmark ruling on civil liberties. The contrast is the final blow. She is at the peak of the world, and he is beneath the floorboards. This total ruin is why people share the video. It proves that while power can be weaponized by the small-minded, it can be reclaimed by the righteous. The $18 million wasn't just a number. It was the price of a mother's tears, and every penny was paid in full by the man who thought she didn't belong.